Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last class, we talked about basically how the United States enters and fights in World War I. Today, I want to go back to the home front and see what's happening back in the United States during the war in Episode 4, The War at Home. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to, number 10, explain how businesses and government cooperated during the war. Number 11, identify attacks on civil liberties carried out by both citizens and government. And number 12, summarize the social changes that affect African Americans and women. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 10. World War I was a huge war effort that needed to be rolled out on a massive scale that the United States had never done before. And so the American economy needed to shift from producing consumer goods, like, getting all of the radios and things that you need in America, to producing war supplies. But that shift was too urgent to let private industry adapt on its own. And so the government took over the effort to make that shift happen more quickly. Congress gave President Wilson direct control over much of the economy, mostly through the War Industries Board. The War Industries Board, created in 1917, was directed by Bernard Baruch. He was a prosperous businessman, and basically, under his leadership, the War Industries Board urged producers to switch to mass production techniques and standardizing its products to increase efficiency. Under the War Industries Board, the industrial production in the United States increased sharply by 20%. It had mixed success in the long run, though. While the War Industries Board was controlling prices at the wholesale level, the shortage of consumer goods that resulted from stopping making consumer goods to suddenly making wartime goods, that forced up prices for American consumers. It nearly doubled the cost of important goods. On the other hand, corporate profits also soared, so businessmen were making a pretty good amount of money on this, and shareholders, especially people in the chemicals, meatpacking, oil, and steel businesses. Besides the War Industries Board, the Railroad Administration controlled, surprise, the railroads. And the fuel administrations monitored coal supplies and were rationing fuels like gasoline and heating oil. To conserve resources in an effort to shift all of those productions from domestic use to foreign use, while still needing it at the home side as well, people adopted some techniques like gasless Sunday, where they wouldn't use gas appliances or gasoline, or lightless nights, where they would stop turning on electricity, which would, greater demand of coal. In March of 1918, the Fuel Administration even invented a new policy known as daylight savings time to try to take advantage of the longer days of the summer. Go move the clocks an hour while the sun is up, so people don't have to use light bulbs as much. Subpoint B. We also see a change in the wartime economy, besides just, production of goods, but in terms of how it's going to carry out on the sense of dollars for people. Industrial wages rose. If a person could work in a factory, we saw their wages go up by as much as 20% with the increased demand for production. Those raises, though, they came at a cost, and the cost was that the cost of living was going up as well. To go pay for those higher wages and a sudden the demand of goods, it raised the cost of living by, food and housing was also went up. So while the overall paycheck is going up, the amount of money they have to spend also goes up, and they end up kind of offsetting each other. Large corporations, though, were making enormous profits. Take, for instance, the DuPont company, the chemical manufacturer. They saw their stock multiply in value 1,600% in the 4 years of World War I. Suddenly, chemicals were wildly valuable. But the income gap between management and workers complicated things. Management who were participating in the stock bonuses were seeing huge increases, but the overall, while people were getting paid more, the jump was so dramatic. The demand for materials made factories speed up production to produce things as fast as they could. But they also came with dangerous conditions and child labor and the unfair pay. They often brought union strikes, and 6,000 strikes of organized labor were, broke out during the war years. Strikes threatened wartime production, though. If workers are going to walk off the job in a strike, that threatens wartime production. So Woodrow Wilson created a new board known as the National War Labor Board to go settle disputes. Basically, if a striker felt they were being treated, if a union went on strike because they were being treated unfairly, the National War Labor Board would take representatives from the union and take representatives from the management and try to bring them together. Factories were pushed to go accept an 8-hour workday and improve factory conditions. And if workers, basically refused to accept the terms of the settlement and go on strike anyway, then they would lose their draft exemptions. And the National War Labor Board would basically turn it into a policy that became nicknamed either go to work or go fight, work or fight. Subpoint C, to help produce food to go support now, 2 continents, because America is still eating at home, but our soldiers are going overseas, and Europe is in war, so they're having a hard time producing their own food, so America has to go produce food basically for 2 continents at once. So Wilson set up the Food Administration Board under a control of a talented mining engineer named Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover he basically grew up as a poor kid and became a mining engineer. Basically means he's in the prospecting business, but was very, very good at it. But took over food production and brought this kind of like engineering, scientific mindset to how do you feed 2 continents at once. And the administration under Hoover's direction worked to produce food and to save food at the same time. Preaching what he called the gospel of the clean plate, he encouraged public conservation. One day of the week was considered a sweetless day of the week, where you would go without sugars so the sugars could be used in other production. Or another to be wheatless, to have a wheatless day. Then the bread and wheat products could be shipped off somewhere else. Another to be porkless, to go really focus on a vegetables diet that could be grown at home in what was known as victory gardens. These victory gardens, were basically backyard plots of land to grow people grow their own food. The government set a high price on wheat and on staple foods. That promoted farmers to increase their production, and it worked. It raised farm production by 30%. These measures allowed Americans to triple their food shipments to the Allies, both feeding a continent at home, however meagerly, but also to be able to make important shipments to allies overseas. Subpoint D. To pay for all of this came at an expensive cost, and the United States spent $35.5 billion, and that's billion dollars in the 19-teens numbers, on the war effort. A third of it was paid through direct taxes, this newly instituted income tax that was promoted by Taft and signed into law by Wilson. And they borrowed as much as 2/3 of the rest of it through the sale of war bonds. War bonds are a way that the government borrows money, investments that citizens make to loan the government money to go finance the war. Basically, citizens go and they buy a piece of paper known as a war bond, and they pay $100 for the bond, and when it comes to maturity, they'll get the $100 back plus the interest that's paid on it. That's the idea of a war bond. Bonds still exist today. They're what controls government debt. Subpoint E. To go popularize the war, to go make all of these, trade-offs that people have to go work all the time and food is scarce and, the government's going into debt to do that, to go make that palatable to Americans, the Wilson administration introduced a Committee on Public Information. And the Committee on Public Information was really there to go popularize World War I. It used, I think we would say, outright propaganda, biased communication designed to influence people. It was led by a former muckraking journalist, a guy named George Creel, and the CPI persuaded artists and ad agencies to create thousands of posters and paintings and cartoons and sculptures, all of which were there to go designed to promote World War I. Around 75,000 people were recruited also to be what were known as 4-minute men. The 4-minute men would be speakers about war issues, things about the draft and rationing and bond drives and victory gardens and what it meant to just be an American and the meaning of American. And they would go and give these 4-minute speeches in public areas. They sometimes, after a church service, a 4-minute man, they've got a congregation there, 4-minute man would go make a claim for it. Or before public events or theater shows, whenever there was a crowd of people, be a 4-minute man that were giving the sales pitch on why it was important to be fighting in World War I. The Committee of Public Information also stirred up a lot of hysteria, and I think a lot of this is where we begin to kind of critique how America approached World War I. The hysteria appealed to the darker side of public outrage. German people were sometimes portrayed as animals and often referred to as brutes, prompting mean-spirited attacks on German Americans. Subpoint 11. And this anti-immigrant hysteria, it prompted attacks on immigrants, like I said, in particular that of Germany, but also from Austria-Hungary. Even native-born Americans of German descent were considered targets. Americans with German last names often lost their jobs. Orchestras refused to play important Austrian and German composers, people like Mozart and Bach and Beethoven and Brahms. And if you know much about classical music, that's a huge segment missing out of your repertoire. Schools stopped teaching German language classes, and librarians removed books from shelves written by German authors. Even things like diseases, the German measles, today we know it as rubella, were renamed the Liberty measles, and for the life of me, I don't know why. Hamburgers, a hamburger is named after Hamburg. It's a city in Germany. They were renamed Salisbury steaks because it seemed more Anglo. I don't know. Dachshunds, like the wiener dog, you wouldn't call them dachshunds anymore. That's a German word meaning badger hound. But no, now they became Liberty pups and Liberty pups and Frankfurters, like named after Frankfurt, Germany. No, not anymore. We call those things hot dogs. It was a systematic, well, maybe not systematic, but certainly real effort to go erase any kind of German pieces from the American culture. Subpoint B. In June of 1917 and in May of 1918, two laws were passed known as the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, and we refer to them together as the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And they both combined to enable courts to fine people or even to imprison people for interfering with the war effort or by speaking out against the government. Though these things clearly violated the First Amendment, over 2,000 prosecutions for anti-war activities targeted socialists and labor leaders. Take, for instance, Eugene V. Debs, who we've met a few times already. Eugene V. Debs was jailed for 10 years, and the anarchist Emma Goldman was jailed and then deported for having unpopular ideas. I think you can always claim that the First Amendment exists specifically to protect these things. Well, the First Amendment protects a whole lot of kinds of speech. It's really about your ability to petition and redress your government. It's really about telling your government that they're doing something wrong. But the Espionage and Sedition Acts criminalized those pieces as speaking out against the war was distinctly un-American. Roman numeral number 12. The war also encouraged some pretty significant pieces of social change. Take, for instance, of African Americans. African Americans' opinion on the war was divided. There's no black voice on World War I. Though in general, we might say that they generally supported the war. Take, for instance, W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois supported the war and urged support for the war. He believed that black support would strengthen the call for racial justice and it would raise the profile of African Americans who supported the war effort. By contrast, black publisher William Monroe Trotter, whom we met earlier in this unit, William Monroe Trotter believed that victims of racism shouldn't support a racist government and accused W.E.B. Du Bois of being an accommodationist. We often level the charge accommodationist to not W.E.B. Du Bois, but to Booker T. Washington. But in this case, saying that the government supports this war and the government is racist, William Monroe Trotter says that W.E.B. Du Bois is participating in the same racist policies. Subpoint B. Wartime jobs on a practical level to everyday black people led to a movement of Southern blacks from the South to the North, hoping to escape the racial discrimination and also to go find job opportunities in the industrial North that were booming with factory work. And there were not enough immigrants to go take those positions. The war had disrupted immigration to the United States. There, African Americans found new jobs, but they also found new racial tensions. Just because, in the American popular understanding, we think of the South as the bad one on racism and the North is the good one on racism. The truth is there's racists everywhere. And in this great migration of people moving out of the South to the North, there they just found new and different kinds of problems. In subpoint C, let's focus on how women were affected by World War I. A lot of women took jobs in heavy industries, which had previously been the domain of men. They became railroad workers and cooks and dock workers and bricklayers, traditional men's jobs now filling by women, even as much as mining coal and building ships. It was a new era for women's employment. Men were often off fighting in the war, so to go fill those jobs, women stepped into the role. They often, though, if they weren't doing industrial jobs, many women were volunteering in the war effort, serving in Red Cross facilities, planting victory gardens, or selling war bonds to go support the effort monetarily. Many women, though, on the other hand, were active in the peace movement, notably Jane Addams. We met Jane Addams in our last unit as the social gospelist founder of the Settlement House movement. But here she founded the National Peace Party in 1915. Jane Addams was a strong anti-imperialist and a strong pacifist who didn't see any practice in what was going on in World War I as good for society. Subpoint D, an unexpected crisis hit in 1918 when the international flu epidemic came to the United States. We often refer to it now as the Spanish flu, a little bit unfairly, but that's the name that carries on. Nearly a quarter of the American population got the flu, and it shocked the American economy. Mines shut down, communications suffered, factories had to stagger working hours to keep the disease from spreading. Doctors were totally bewildered, and many cities ran short of coffins. Today, influenza doesn't dramatically affect a lot of us, just our treatment plans have changed so much. But here in these early days of the 20th century, flu could absolutely be deadly. And a quarter of Americans getting it, it resulted in 500,000 Americans dying. Worldwide, nearly 30 million people died in this flu epidemic. And then in 1919, it suddenly disappeared. It's not unusual with viral strains to sort of wear themselves out. And it just appeared that's kind of what happened. Also, new treatments were coming along that the influenza of 1918, that Spanish flu, didn't seem to be so deadly anymore, but while it was raging, it really raged. The question of how World War I is going to be carried out at home or abroad is a complicated story that has a lot of different players in it. The countries of Europe, different positions in the United States, and they're all going to come together poorly in a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.